Hello everyone, this is the finale of What If Naruto Got Lost During His Training TS, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. We are to split up into 13 more groups, as that is the number of factions that were present in the former base of the country's operations. One of Group 6's officers stated, each group will be in charge of eradicating one rebel factions, completely and totally wiped out. Not a single member is to escape alive. Men, women, and even the children, are not to be allowed to go on living. We are to send them to the crossworlds as fast as possible, a mage officer stated. The orders have been passed on to the officers assigned to each group, so pack up, and move out. The main officer of the whole group announced. The first rebel faction that had been found had set up the base in a mountain, not on a mountaintop, but inside a mountain in the country. Their base of operations were found in caves inside a mountain, near the 6th base of operations, the one where they had all met in. At the very foot of the mountain was a small village, one where the Naruto forces were sure that their families stayed in, and where members of the faction could easily sometimes be seen in. They let loose the wolves of war once nightfall covered the land, specifically the village and the mountain. The direwolves made quick work of all the rebels in and around the village, while the soldiers themselves entered the many caves and wiped out all the rebels inside and on the mountain. By morning the mountain and the village below it were crying tears of blood. There was just so much of it, all life in the place had been snuffed out, even the animals had lost their lives, all were added to the multiple crossworlds. The other factions had shared a similar fate, their bases of operations, as well as their families were wiped out completely. It really was their fault for not thinking ahead, for not thinking of the future. The only rebels in the country remaining were those staying in the 6th base, the one that the rest of Group 6 were still surrounding. When word had reached the remaining rebel faction forces, they were incensed at the S of the innocent, or those that they had deemed innocent. How could anyone condone the S of children as the Naruto forces had done? They no longer cared, they continued their rebellious activities, by sneaking out after dark around the invaders' encampments. They thought that they had outsmarted the invading force. But in truth they were the ones being tricked into believing that their cause was a good one, and the way they went about doing things was the way things must go. They believed in their superiority due to the fact that they were still surviving even though many of their number had already fallen. They were overconfident, they knew not that they were the coup d'grace, the climax of the purge. They seemed to show no care for the non-combatant family and friends, therefore the Naruto forces devised a way to have the rebellious civilians meet up with their rebel family members meet up for one final time. The Naruto forces had their mage corps completely hide their presence from the rebels, which made it possibly for them to come out of their hiding place unprepared for an ambush. There were a few chakra users in the group, which had informed the rest that the only people in the field above the base, outside of the entrance of the base, were in fact their family members. These so-called innocents had been brainwashed into believing that they had to meet up with their loved ones, thinking that they simply had to. They were made to believe that there was a threat that was going to wipe out all the rebels in one fell swoop, leaving them alive, to mourn their loss, and be forced to live a life of shame, thinking that they had done nothing to aid in the liberation of their country from the rule of a tyrant, and from invaders from an unknown land. When the rebels left the safety of their underground base to meet with their family members, the Naruto forces, some of them anyway, under the power of illusions snuck their way into the base, and positioned themselves in such a way that once the signal was given they would be able to cut the rebel factions to pieces from the inside, moving out. Not all the rebels had gone out, only those that still had loved ones still left alive. These were the ones that would S within the caves that they had turned into their central base of operations. It had been made a point that the rebel leaders' families were left unharmed, and word had been spread that they had been able to escape due to the aid of their fellow rebels. The truth of the matter was that they had been captured and been brainwashed into believing such lies. Once all the rebel leaders, and everyone else that still had family, had left the safety of their underground base, the Naruto forces, still invisible to the NI, surrounded the rebels. There were few enough that one invader could take care of 5 rebels. The officer in charge of the operation revealed himself to the rebels, appearing as if he had no weapons on his person, which was true as he did not carry even a knife to defend himself with. "Thank you for coming to this reunion," the officer stated to the shock of the rebels that had no idea that he was there, as well as to the surprise and bewilderment of the ex-Otonins of the group. "What are you doing here, Invader SC?" one of the rebels shouted out. "I'm here to send all of you to hell," the officer said. "What can one man do against us?" one of the rebel leaders shouted. "Plenty," the officer said. "Now say your farewells, lest you regret not doing so in the future." Instead of listening to the officer, some of the rebels took out their weapons and prepared to attack the visible officer. But once one of the rebels moved, chaos somewhat occurred. The family member of the rebel family began one by one. For every step that the rebels had made towards the officer, whom they assumed was doing the king using some invisible jutsu, the king grew in intensity. By the time that the first rebel had reached the officer, lives began waning every second, and the field was stained crimson at the number of people that were being killed. By the time that a rebel had dared to thrust his sword into the officer, that rebel was speared through the chest by an invisible lancer beside the officer. "That's that," the officer of Group 6 announced after the last rebel had been killed in the operation. "Time to join up with the other groups at the meeting point." "Hi," his subordinated responded, and they began to move out, already having packed up all of their things. When Group 6 started to make their move on the rebel factions, Group 7 started to make their way to the meeting point, as the base that they had been assigned to had gone under self-destruction after the first soldier had stepped foot inside the facility. Apparently the forces that had been camped within the 7th base were the reinforcements for the 4th base, and had left their base of operations with all their defenses and securities up and running to their full capacity, recognizing the fact that it was possible that they would not be getting back to their beloved base of operations. Groups 8 and 9 had not found any resistance from the bases that were assigned to them, and allowed them to go to the meeting place ahead of schedule. It also allowed them to infiltrate the village city, to spy on the place, and find any and all that would need to be saved in case the place was pro-Orochimaru. The priorities had changed. Instead of leaving it alone in case it was neutral, it was deemed as a threat due to the reports about the rebel factions. They must have been getting funding and support from somewhere, and it sure as hell wasn't the capital of the land of rice fields. The infiltrators were able to find out that the noble families of the village city were the ones that had encouraged the formation of the rebel factions, finding that they could each be a more suitable leader as compared to their present leader, which was Orochimaru. These nobles were similar to the Hyuga and the Uchiha of Konoha, both of whom wished to rule instead of the leaders that they had sworn to serve under. When all the groups had converged at the meeting place, there were only half of the original number that had started out to take out the 9 bases of operations within the country. But due to the recruits that were picked up along the way, the Rosuto force was enough to take out an entire poorly defended hidden village. Sure, it had shinobi, but the Rosuto forces had been able to deal with those before. Sure, it had the numbers on their side, but the Rosuto force had mages to even the odds. Some of the invaders were made to wear disguises to allow them to infiltrate the village en masse. Once inside, they would make their way around the place, positioning themselves around the inner side of the massive wall that defended the village. When they were all in, they would each radio in that they were in position and wait for the signal to commence the actual operation. Some of the other soldiers were made to travel through the sewers. Without the aid of the daimyo, they were unable to pinpoint the locations of the people that were deemed salvageable, but they would be doing something else instead. They had somehow procured the schematics of the hidden village, as well as a list of addresses of the people that would be saved from the that would occur overnight. The ones traveling through the sewers would be laying all the transport seals beneath the areas that held these people. Those others that were sucked in by the technique would just be considered as lucky, and the Shokan members in the shadows over where Mikio was would deal with any unwanted people that accidentally were transported. Other soldiers were deployed and ordered to make their way a few meters away from outside of the hidden village. Their task was to jump right into the hidden village, and kill as many people as they possibly could in the shortest amount of time, not literally jump in, as the wall would come tumbling down by the time they made their move. The rest of the soldiers were ordered to wait some meters beyond the gates into the village. The mages were told to keep watch over the village, literally over. They rode on the rocks and kept literal watch over the village. They would also provide aerial support for the ground forces, and would be the ones in charge of causing fire to rain down from the heavens, which would then cause the hidden village to run gold with fire. The shinobi recruits as well as the experimented people that were recruited were also given a task, one that would make great use of their speed. They were tasked with getting out all the information, knowledge, and whatnot that the hidden village held, with it was anything that would be of value to Orochimaru that they could find. They were also tasked with rescuing any and all Rosuto forces that were trapped within the flames. A risky business, but somebody had to do it. The Rosuto forces hadn't expected one of their commanders to be present for the operation. But Tokichi Yoshiko had made it a point to be where she needed to be, with her troops. It was quite a boost of morale when she arrived on a horse of all things, clad in full body armor, the kind that allowed her to move as gracefully as any kunoichi. She had been hardened by battles during her youth, but at the same time, she knew how to play her part well, during war. She insisted on being the one to signal for the start of the destruction of the last remaining threat to the invasion force, Orochimaru not being quite that much of a threat, as he had been wearing himself out in the south, on the border between rice field and fire. Somehow the Rosuto officers had managed to convince the nobles of the hidden village to meet with one of their officers in private, and speak about possibly a possible truce, something that they were sure the current leader of Rice Field would not have thought of, not that the man ever really thought of the good of the people, his people. Yoshiko had been escorted into a private meeting room where all the heads of the noble families of Rice Field, all the heads of the nobility of the country, and not just of the hidden village. Negotiations began in earnest, all of the heads trying the damnedest to milk the negotiations for all it was worth. They were protected from the outside by several seals, held by their Anbu defenders within the room. They were also defended by a sound barrier that allowed no sound to get in or out of the room. Therefore these heads of clans were unaware that as soon as the doors to the room were locked, the invading force began their operation. The closing of the doors by none other than Yoshiko herself was the signal to begin the attack, and promised M of Otogakure no Sato, the hidden village in the sound. As the walls of the hidden village came tumbling down, the transportation seals were activated, and the shinobi and regular soldiers began tumbling into the village, the shinobi running in and out with as much information and materials and supplies as they could seal and thus carry, while the soldiers went about killing any and all that were not one of them. There were a number of archers mounted on the rocks above the hidden village that had taken a liking to sniping the citizens from such a great height. They were aided by the mages with them. The mages allowing them to have the sight of a bird of prey, and they also helped by having the winds not become obstacles of the arrow's flight pathwise. Men, women, and children, shinobi, and regular soldiers alike, all of them were no match for the Rosuto forces that stormed through what was left of the gates. The people that had decided to use the underground escape routes were also no match for the soldiers and some shinobi that had decided to wait in the escape tunnels underneath the hidden village in case the people would do as they did, which was to escape the attack. But unfortunately they would be allowed to escape, just not with their lives intact. Their boss, lifeless boss that is, would be allowed to escape due to the flushing of the sewers and the underground tunnels that had been planned to be done in order to make sure that no one really escaped with their lives. When the invading soldiers could no longer take the strain of attacking constantly, the officers gave the order to withdraw, which also coincided with Yoshiko's decision to leave the hidden village, the room which held the negotiation for the truce treaty having been painted crimson with the blood of the other participants and the guards. She left the hidden village via teleportation seal, and ended up back in the camp that her mother was still resting in. Once she arrived there, she had one of the communications people contact the officer in charge of the running of the actual operation, informing him of her safe escape, and that they could proceed with firebombing the hidden village, and turning it into a black spot on the world's surface. It was a week after the hidden village had been decimated that the Rosuto Ricefield invasion force had finally reached the border between Ricefield and fire. Tsukiko was back to full health, as was her daughter, and the only remaining problem was Orochimaru, and his remaining Junin and up forces. But they decided to allow him to battle with the fire defenders for a bit longer, to allow the invaders some much-needed rest. Such actions gave Orochimaru the impression that the Rosuto commanders thought of his performance as acceptable, and that he would be able to temporarily ally himself with them, which would also allow him to gain some of their secrets. He thinks that just because we are not attacking him as well that he has gained our respect, Tsukiko said. Well, at least it makes him think that we will not be attacking him anytime soon, Yoshiko said. But we will have to speak with him sometime, Tsukiko said. Will we be king him then? Yoshiko asked. Certainly, Sukiko answered, he has committed enough crimes to warrant such a death by our hands. That Anoto-sama really does dislike him, Yoshiko said, then asked, but what of the Uchiha? Ik the heavy senin, while you take care of that insect, Sukiko said, not a bit of her like the Uchiha all that much, I want him to be but a stain on the ground. If you say so, Okar-sama. X. The end. X. That will be all for this video, be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos, goodbye.